everybody, welcome to Your Own Pathway, Leadership and Mental Wellbeing. For those who don't know me, my name is Paya Wu. I'm a licensed psychotherapist and trauma-informed leadership consultant, and I help leaders realign to their values and rebuild trust. Because leadership isn't just about performance, it's about how power impacts people. So let's own it. Today's episode is not but I'm doing this episode because I want to name something. I'm speaking today, as you heard in my introduction, that I'm a trauma informed leadership consultant with a background in psychotherapy and with extensive experience working with trauma, both individual trauma and organizational trauma. And so when most people think about trauma, they think about personal experiences that happen outside of work. Most people don't think about trauma occurring at work. And I'm here today to clarify that assumption, to say that assumption no longer holds, unfortunately. Because what we are seeing more and more across industries and communities is that trauma does occur in the workplace. It occurs when safety is lost. It occurs when power is uneven or misused. It occurs when systems act on people's bodies and lives in ways that they cannot control. And it occurs when leadership has the ability to protect and chooses not to. Sometimes that trauma is organizational. Sometimes it is the result of external harm and systematic forces colliding with the workplace. And very often, it is compounded by silence. Today's episode exists to talk about leadership's role in moments like this. Because when fear or threat enters the workplace, even if it originates outside of the organization, leadership does not get to opt out. And especially in these moments, people look to leadership. They look to leadership for clarity, advocacy, and most importantly, humanity. And when there's mixed power, when leaders hold decision-making authority, influence, and the ability to intervene and chooses not to, that is when trust erodes quickly, even and especially if that power is not used to protect their workers. So I want to say this. If you watched my previous episode, you would know that currently I am in an area where there is a lot of ice activity, ice raids, and it's not a safe place for a lot of us up here, and especially for people of color. And we have some big Fortune 500 companies here in the Twin Cities area. So I want to say that employers have an ethical responsibility. In this episode, and what I'm talking about today, this is not just about politics. This is about trauma. This is about trust. And this, again, is about leadership responsibility. So I want you all to pause with me for a second here. When you go to work, when we all go to work, when you clock in, put on your uniform, have your badge or your name tag, you don't think, most of us don't ever think, in jobs where where our safety is not, where our job is not about safety, public safety, we don't ever think, is today the day that I'm taken? You don't think, is today the day that I might be detained? or I might be questioned, or I might not make it home. And the fact that we even have to say this out loud tells us something is deeply wrong, because work is supposed to be neutral ground. It is supposed to be a place that does not have fear. It is supposed to be a place where your body is on alert before your shift even starts. And when that safety disappears, leadership has already failed, whether it's acknowledged or not. So again, work has always been a place of don't be political. We should stay neutral. Don't say this, because it's bad for us. Don't be political, especially in leadership and mental well being spaces. The thing is, here is the uncomfortable truth. It is deeply concerning that physical safety and psychological safety have been politicized at all. The expectation that you should not be harmed at work is not an ideology. It is not a belief system. It is a baseline human expectation. And when that safety itself becomes controversial, that is not a culture disagreement. That is a leadership failure. So let's talk about psychological safety and where it actually begins. It begins in the body. Psychological safety does not begin with value statements or trust exercises. Yes, I had to go there. It begins in the body. If the nervous system does not feel safe, the mind cannot regulate. If the body is bracing for threat, trust collapse automatically. This is trauma science. So when employees fear that something beyond their control could happen to them at work, especially something physical, the workplace becomes a site of threat. And how can this show up as? And if you are a leader watching this, these are signs to look for. Or if you are a worker feeling this, here are some signs to look for: hypervigilance, shutdown, loss of trust, moral injury. And oftentimes, from the outside, if you are a leader who is looking at your worker, you're thinking, oh, this person is just disengaging or they're quiet quitting. I want to say that all the symptoms that I just named is not disengagement. It is survival physiology. So, trauma. Trauma is physical, trauma is coercive, and it's about power. And I want to be very clear that trauma is not just emotional distress. Trauma is defined by loss of control, power, the power imbalance that presents itself, and threat. So when a worker is accosted or questioned or removed while simply doing their job without having broken any type of policy or rules that causes harm, or the wrongdoings committed, that is trauma exposure right there. And so, I want to use the example of Target. And yes, I'm going there. This is my second episode of using Target as an example, because let's be honest, Target is, there are a lot of their policies. They are if you want to study anything about business, study Target. Yes, I said it, because Target is a Minneapolis-based business. And so I'm going to use them here. So in the case of Target, with the physical and the psychological safety. There was a situation where the target workers were young. The worker was young. The worker holds little power in the system. The worker was working and did nothing wrong. And yet, through all of this person was still being detained, was detained, not being detained by um, by ICE. And in that situation, leadership did nothing to intervene or protect. And so what happens is the nervous system does not ask for nuance. When you're the person going through this, what it asks is, am I safe here? And unfortunately, in that situation, no, they were not safe. So let's talk about this. As I'm doing this episode, safety. Safety is a baseline and it should not even be considered a perk. And I want to reiterate this, as I said earlier. If your job does not involve being part of like law enforcement, military services, or emergency response, or an explicit expectation of danger, then physical safety at your job should not be negotiable. Yes. Retail workers or office workers or teachers or nurses did not consent to bodily risk. And in this case, that teenagers, did not sign up for exposure or force. Employees, when they go work who are not in these type of jobs that I mentioned, did not agree to be collateral damage because employment does not equal consent to harm. And so let's name the pattern and why this comes up again and again. So, as I mentioned, that this is my second episode of using Target as an example, and they are a great case study for anybody who wants to learn about business, what not to do. So, Target, in the previous episode that I did, I discussed about what happens when DEI is removed and how quickly trust erodes when people no longer feel protected or valued. So, I'm returning to, I'm using Target as not as personal, but again, as an example, especially being here in the Twin Cities and having its base here in Minneapolis. This organization, Target, has become a very visible example of what happens when enormous power exists and that power is not used for protection. Because power silence equals broken trust. And when organizations hold cultural and economic power, people expect something very basic in return, which is protection, advocacy, humanity. So when workers are threatened or harmed while doing their job and leadership chooses to remain silent, trust doesn't just weaken it, it breaks. So this is not about intent, this is about impact. From the employee's perspective, silence sounds like, well, you're on your own. Your safety is not our priority. And when the public witnesses workers being harmed at work, which in the case of this sample, Target, yes, everything was out in the public, and yet sees no response. Backlash to this is not irrational. What it is a loss of trust response. So let's discuss about Target specifically when trust becomes visible. And unfortunately, it is very invisible for them. So I've been planning to do this episode a while back. And, every time I want to record something, something new pops up about Target. And the brand reputation data for Target has already shifted. And this organization is no longer showing up among one of the most trusted or most respected brands for Fortune 500 companies. And that matters a lot because what happened was trust does not disappear overnight. It erodes. And when it erodes, when people experience repeated gaps between values and behavior, it erodes when workers don't feel protected. It erodes when leadership stays silent during moments of visible harm. This isn't about punishment for them, it's about consequences. So when employees lose trust, the public eventually follows. And when the public loses trust, it shows up in reputation, loyalty, and business outcomes. Trust is not an abstract. And we are seeing very much of this. What it is it is measurable. And unfortunately, once it's gone, it's very hard to earn back. So when loss of safety becomes public action, we're seeing all of this play right now, especially with Target. And again, as I'm recording this episode, the organization is Target is once again in the news, and again for not very good reasons. Their newest CEO just started, and we saw boycotts within the last year. We've also seen demonstrations inside stores, and we've also seen planned protests at corporate headquarters here in Minneapolis. So as all of this is unfolding as new leadership steps into the role, that timing matters. Why? Because what this shows us is something leaders still underestimate. When psychological safety and physical safety break down, communities respond, employees respond, consumers respond, and the public responds. Because this isn't outrage culture, this is pattern recognition, especially with Target. And so this episode is very nuanced because there's lots of parts to it. And, when I drafted this outline for this episode, something new is always coming up. And I want to talk about when statements replace protection. Since I did the outline, there's so many things that happen, especially up here in the Twin Cities. And I want to show a letter that some of the top 60 employers here in Minnesota and the Twin Cities drafted. And so I'm going to share my screen here. Hopefully you all can see. Let me know if you can't. I will put the letter in the description box too. So let's see if this works. Bear with me for a second. Okay, so here was a letter that was drafted after the second event of a resident, unfortunately being a victim of everything that's going on here. And so here was a letter, open letter from more than 60 CEOs of Minnesota-based companies, January 25th. And the full text here says, the business community in Minnesota prides itself in providing leadership and solving problems to ensure a strong and vibrant state. The recent challenges facing our state has created widespread disruption and tragic loss of life. For the past several weeks, representatives of Minnesota's business community have been working every day behind the scenes with federal and state and local officials to advance real solutions. These efforts have included close communication with the governor, the White House, the vice president, and local mayors. There are ways for us to come together to foster progress. With yesterday's tragic news, we are now calling for an immediate de escalation of tensions for state, local, and federal officials to work together to find solutions. We have been working for generations to build a strong and vibrant state here in Minnesota, and will do so in the many months and years ahead with the equal and even greater commitment. In this difficult moment for our community, we call for peace and focused cooperation among local, state, and federal leaders to achieve a swift and durable solution that enables families, businesses, our employees, and communities across Minnesota to resume our work to build a bright and prosperous future. And so you can see the companies here that signed this, I think below here, has all of this. And so I am going to close out of that here. Okay. And so honestly, to me, this sounded like nothing. Like response, some people applaud it, some people criticize it. And I'm going to be honest, from a trauma informed leadership lens, I understand why people criticized it because the letter speaks about peace. It speaks about unity. It speaks about de escalation, but it does not answer the question how? Like, how are you protecting us as employees? How are employers supporting psychological safety right now for those who are impacted by this? How are they addressing physical safety when harm is happening in and around the workplace? What policies and procedures and advocacy exist when external harm enters internal systems? Like, what? Like, it sounded very neutral, and neutrality in moments of harm is not is now it doesn't it comes from very privileged, and it's very distant, and so external harm still demands internal leadership. So just reading that letter, to me this was like a failed leadership moment, because harm does not have to originate inside a system. And, as I read that letter out loud, there's a part of me, and I'm sure a lot of people who read it also, who criticized it and said, and I want to bring forth that external harm, this is coming from the outside, still demands internal leadership. And yes, you know what? I'm going to call it out. Maybe these companies are doing things to address to their workers that they're not saying out in public. And if so, great. However, in reading that letter and using Target as an example, harm does not have to originate inside an organization for leadership to be responsible. When external systems create fear, instability, or threat, leaders still have a duty to ask, what protections are in place for our people? How are we advocating when the system fails? What boundaries are we setting? Who speaks up when safety for all of us, especially our employees, is compromised? And when those questions go unanswered, statements like the one I just read about peace begin to feel like lip service. Even if that was not the intention, and employees are done. They're done with lip service. They are watching what leaders do and not what they say. All of us have heard of this. To separate our work life from our home life and our home life from our work life, that you have to have separate boundaries. But the reality is, public crisis, and trauma does not stop at the door. It does not stop at the door. Fear does not clock out, and leadership does not get to disappear when conditions become uncomfortable. Avoidance is not neutrality, it is a leadership choice, and avoidance destroys psychological safety faster than anything else. So, the work that I do is trauma informed leadership. And what does this actually require to be trauma informed? And I want to talk and say that when I talk about trauma informed, I'm not asking for leaders to be a therapist. I'm asking that they understand what trauma informed is about. I can tell you that it's not about silence, it's not about legal distancing. What it is its visible presence, clear safety boundaries, advocacy for workers, naming what is actually happening, and using power to protect, not distance. Trauma informed leaders understand that safety is infrastructure. So when that safety collapses, everything else follows. That includes morale, loyalty, retention, and especially reputation. So I want to close out with this. I want to close this episode with saying that when there is immense power, which a lot of corporations have, and when that power is met with silence instead of protection, you will lose people. And you just won't lose people. You will lose trust, you will lose credibility, and ultimately, you will lose business. That's not an ideology, that's reality. And again, unfortunately, Target is a prime example of this. Because leadership is not just about decisions made in comfort. It's about what you do when safety is threatened. It's about whether you use your power to protect or to disappear. Because when trauma enters a workplace, leaders still have a responsibility to name it, to respond to it, and to do everything possible to protect their people. So I know that this episode was very nuanced, very layered, and with everything going on, especially in 2026, staying silent, staying neutral, and saying, taking a stance, saying, oh no, we don't want to be political. Unfortunately, consumers know, see, and have access and resources to who is speaking out and who chooses to stay neutral. So that is all I have for you all today. And again, this is Your Own Pathway, where leadership is owned, presence matters, and power is news responsibility. So I will see you all next time. Take care of you. Bye.